Hello, everybody. Thank you for joining us today for a Power Hour with the Native Wellness Institute. My name is Michaela Madrid, and I am a committee member with the MMIWR PDX Planning Group. This week's Power Hours are committed to the MMIWR National Call to Action. Yesterday was the National Day of Awareness on May 5th. So we're doing this as part of our local MMIWR committee's efforts to bring awareness on this important issue in Portland. Today's Power Hour is sponsored by the Urban Indian Health Institute, and we're really just excited to get into some issues about MMIW. So with that, we'll have Jen start us off.
Good afternoon, everybody. I'm going to share my presentation now. So thank you all for joining us. I greatly appreciate it. My name is Jenn Hollandsworth and I am the Police Records Manager for Portland Police Bureau. Today, I'm going to be discussing missing and murdered Indigenous women from a police perspective. So before we start, I want to introduce myself and talk a little bit about my positionality. On my father's side, I am descended from the Creek and Haida peoples. I hold a master's in public health from the OHSU PSU School of Public Health, and I'm also a doctoral student at the same school. My research interest is trauma and law enforcement and how that affects their interactions with the community. I've been a civilian working in law enforcement for the past 7 years, so I'm not a cop, but I do work with cops. I also want to say that I'm not a police apologist. I do recognize that policing and criminal justice in this country has had a racist history and still produces racist outcomes that persist to this day. So what I want to talk about today is several things. I'm going to start with a little terminology so that we all are on the same page. I want to talk about some historical context related to racism in America, particularly related to Native peoples. I want to talk about some complex issues related to tribal police and their exercise of jurisdiction of law enforcement. I want to talk about what happens when law enforcement in general receives a report of a missing person and how that gets investigated and handled. And then after the investigation, I want to talk about what happens, on the back end. So public records requests and data sharing about missing and murdered Indigenous women. So for terminology, I'm going to tend to use the term missing and murdered Indigenous women. You'll also see this rendered as an abbreviation of MMIW. Other common abbreviations that refer to overlapping groups include missing and murdered Indigenous women and relatives, or missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls, missing and murdered Indigenous women and people, and missing and murdered Indigenous women and two-spirit. So I don't mean to exclude any of those groups when I say missing and murdered Indigenous women. I do mean to include all those groups. Likewise, there are many terms for us Native people. I tend to use the term Native or Indian, but I also am being inclusive of all Indigenous peoples here in North America. For gender and sex, I'm going to refer to women and girls. This is not meant to exclude people who maybe have been identified as female at birth. So I'm going to use the term women and girls instead of female. When it comes to the criminal justice system, we've got a whole slew of different terms to refer to folks. I'm going to, for the most part, just use the word police, which I mean to include city police, county sheriff's deputies, state troopers, tribal police, and just law enforcement in general. Within the world of criminal justice, we often use the term victim. That is a federal term that we use. I recognize that many communities prefer to use the term survivor, so I do not mean to offend when I use that term victim. And then lastly, at the end, I'm going to be talking about public records. That is the term here in Oregon for when we share information publicly that is coming from a police report. In the state of Washington, that's referred to as public disclosure. In other states and federally, that's called Freedom of Information Act. And in some other states, it's even called sunshine laws. But that term public records is just going to refer to the sharing of information publicly. So a little bit of historical context. The author, Isabel Wilkerson, in her book Cast, talks about racism as sort of being the foundation for the house that our American society is built in. So we know that there's both individual racism as well as institutional racism, which can be perpetrated by the American government. You know, historically that started with genocide. When efforts at genocide were not successful, there are other efforts made to erase the identity of Native peoples. Some of those efforts include the marrying of Native women to white men. Those were not always consensual marriages or fully equal marriages as we know them now. You know, one of those marriages was my great-great-great-grandmother, Katona, also known as Lucy, who was married to a man named John W. Gray. Later on, we had boarding schools and other forms of assimilation. So on the left, you can see my great-grandmother, Ruth Lightheart, and her younger sister, my great-grandaunt, Minnie Lightheart. So they definitely went through a process of assimilation into white society within America. And then even more recently, we had things like adoption laws within America that further served to erase Native identity. So on the right is my grandmother, Harleen Dever. When she became pregnant as a young lady, she gave my father up for adoption. And the white people who adopted him chose to not tell my father that he was adopted. He didn't find that out until he was 35. So he grew up thinking he was a white person. And that just shows you how Native identity was historically erased within American society at all levels. And I tell you the story to tie it back to missing and murdered Indigenous women. In many ways, this issue we have, this problem, is a perpetration and a perpetuation of problems that have existed for centuries in this country. So moving on from that historical context, I want to talk a little bit about the jurisdiction of tribal police. I don't expect anyone to actually be able to read this handout. This is intended to be a sort of cheat sheet that allows people to understand when tribal police have jurisdiction over crimes that occur on their land. It's very, very, very complex when tribal police actually have jurisdiction to investigate and then for the tribes to prosecute crimes that occur on their land. It depends on whether the suspect is Indian. It depends on whether the victim is Indian. And it also depends on what type of crime has occurred. So murder, manslaughter, and kidnapping are always going to be investigated and prosecuted at the federal level. So tribal police do not have authority to investigate those crimes. The Violence Against Women Act several years ago was amended, and it does allow tribal police some jurisdiction over domestic violence. And then for crimes that occur off tribal land, so in a county or a city, that jurisdiction is then going to fall to city, county, or state police to investigate crimes involving Native women that do not occur on tribal land. A few other things I want to mention about jurisdiction. So the state of Oregon is somewhat unusual. I don't believe it's the only state, but it's certainly not the norm. The state of Oregon has a statute on the books that was enacted in 2011 that allows tribal police within Oregon to operate as full police officers throughout the state. That is not the norm throughout most of the country. In most of the country, tribal police, as soon as they leave their lands, have no authority. And then the other thing that I think is important to recognize is that Portland Police Bureau and other police departments locally do give full faith and credit to protection orders being issued by tribal police departments. So that would include things along the lines of what you'd think of as a restraining order. So what happens when a woman or a girl goes missing? So the first thing that happens is somebody makes a call, either to an emergency number like 911 or to a non-emergency number. I've listed the number from Portland and Multnomah County there. And an officer will be dispatched to that call and we'll do some initial investigation based on the information that's available to them. Additionally, people called the records division where I work will enter that missing person into a nationwide law enforcement database. But I put an asterisk there because it's not entirely nationwide. Many tribes across this country don't actually have access to that database because of internet bandwidth issues. If they don't have a good internet connection, they're not going to be able to connect to that database and to find out if a person they encounter has been listed as missing. So then that police officer is going to write a report, and the records division comes in again, and they do some initial quality assurance work on that police report to make sure that mandatory data fields have been correctly filled out. A detective may be assigned to the case depending upon the size of the police department, or also that police department's internal procedures, and they will continue that effort to find the missing person. Hopefully, ideally, we are able to locate the missing person and return them to their community. In the case that the worst has happened and they are deceased, we hope to recover their remains and return those to their loved ones. And then also, additionally, when crimes have occurred, we want to get those prosecuted and sent to the local district attorney or prosecuting authority. So I mentioned that the records division will do quality assurance work on the police report. One of the things they check to make sure it's filled out is the race information. I've listed here for you the categories that we have to choose. These are decided for us by the Federal Office of Management and Budget. They're the same categories you see on the census. These categories have some problems to them. So one problem is that the system doesn't allow multiple races to be selected. Another problem is that oftentimes officers will enter this information based on their perception of a person. So an officer, most officers would probably look at me and assume that I'm a white person, and they would check W for white. But that's not the box that I check. I choose the box that says I for American Indian and Alaska Native. Which brings me to another problem. Because it says I for American Indian or Alaska Native, we do occasionally see problems where officers have selected I thinking that refers to an Indian of South Asian descent. The other thing I just want to mention is that there's no centralized database with race information. That's not information that's collected centrally by the federal government. So we don't really know what a person's correct race is unless we're able to ask. Officers are often trained to ask, but they may not ask in every circumstance, particularly if they are concerned that asking about someone's race may trigger fears about immigration status. And I do just want to note that in the state of Oregon, law enforcement are prohibited from engaging in enforcement of federal immigration laws. So moving on to ethnicity and police reports, the only options provided to us are Hispanic or Latino or not Hispanic or Latino. There's no federal option here to recognize tribal affiliation, though sometimes, depending on the police department, the records management system, there may be some workarounds. The other thing is that oftentimes Native peoples get mislabeled as Hispanic or Latino, either due to an assumption if they have a Spanish surname or last name that they are of Latino descent, or based on an officer's perceptions, their physical characteristics such as skin tone or hair color. So when the reporting process is done, oftentimes researchers looking into the problem of missing and murdered Indigenous women will want to obtain information from police about MMIW. And there's a lot of barriers. I'm just going to go through some of these quickly because my colleague Michaela will be covering these, I think, some of these in quite more depth. So most states in the federal government have rules that either prohibit the sharing of certain types of information by law enforcement or allowing law enforcement to withhold some information. In the state of Oregon, we are prohibited from releasing information about child abuse or neglect, which becomes very problematic when we have missing and murdered Indigenous girls, because obviously that would be child abuse. We have a criminal investigation exemption. So if there's an open investigation, we generally don't release that information to protect the integrity of the investigation so that we can find that missing person and prosecute the person who has harmed them. Cases involving sexual assault, we may withhold some or all of the case under the personal privacy exemption because we don't necessarily want to out victims of sexual assault against their will. We don't want to further victimize them. Likewise, under Oregon law, there's also a personal safety exemption, which can be used for victims of domestic violence and stalking, because releasing police reports about the crimes they have been victimized in may cause further dangers to their safety. And then another barrier to sharing information is fees. The state of Oregon does allow for public agencies to charge a reasonable fee that covers the cost to locate and reproduce records. We also, in the state of Oregon, though, do have a fee waiver law that permits state agencies to grant a partial or full fee waiver if releasing a public record is in the public interest. And also many police departments, but not all, will choose to waive the fee for victims of crimes or their families if the victim did not survive. And some also grant a fee waiver if there's a financial hardship to the person requesting the fee. Simply put, if they can't afford to pay the fee. And then finally, sometimes just internal workflow problems and processes cause barriers to data sharing. We had an instance here at Portland Police Bureau where we had a workflow that caused us to be unaware of a request for a public record that had been placed by the Urban Indian Health Institute. And we actually found out about that when the UIHI published the report you see here, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls report. And it stated that Portland Police Bureau had not provided them with their report. We've since fixed that workflow so that it won't happen again. And the workflow problem had nothing to do with MMIWR or race, but we do recognize that it had the outcome of reproducing institutional racism. And I was proud, but also chagrined. I did draft a letter of apology that was signed by Mayor Ted Wheeler and Chief Danielle Outlaw to the Urban Indian Health Institute, just apologizing for the outcome in this case. We've since changed that workflow so that we can share information more freely and more timely with people who are seeking information related to missing and murdered Indigenous women and all of the public's business. So I just want to say thank you to the Native Wellness Institute for hosting this Power Hour. I really appreciate that. And I'm going to pass things on to my colleague, Michaela Madrid of the Sovereign Bodies Institute. Thank you so much.
Thanks, Jen. All right, so now I'm going to pull up my PowerPoint. All right, so hello everyone. Like I mentioned, my name is Michaela Madrid and I am the operations manager with the Sovereign Bodies Institute. I am a member of the Lower Brule Lakota Sioux tribe. I'm originally from South Dakota and currently live in Wyatt Lands in Eureka, California. So today I'm really excited to be able to talk to you a little bit about what we do at SBI and just give you kind of a general overview about what is MMIWG2 and kind of go through some of the different statistics that we have from our database. So before getting too deep into it, I did want to say that this is a really tough issue to talk about, especially if you're someone who has a family member who's missing or murdered or are a survivor of violence. This week has been amazing. There's so many opportunities to learn and to engage on this issue, but it's also really exhausting and really hard work. So I really encourage you to seek out healing opportunities. At SBI, we have a 24/7 confidential support line that accepts both calls and texts. So we can definitely support you. Just please reach out if you're in need of support. So getting right into it, what is MMIWG2? So Indigenous women, girls, and Two-Spirit individuals go missing and are murdered at rates much higher than any race. As Jen alluded to, there are a lot of complicated laws that make reporting crimes a lot more difficult in Indian country, which is one of the reasons that there are such low reporting rates. When they are reported, the cases have a much higher higher percentage of going unsolved and ultimately forgotten by law enforcement. This is based on our experience working with families and survivors and making those phone calls to law enforcement. And it just seems like their cases are so complex because of the different jurisdiction and historical issues that they are much more likely to go to the wayside. And so that is another reason why there's such low reporting rates. When we speak with survivors who didn't report, a lot of times their response is that they didn't think they were going to be believed or that it wasn't worth the trauma of going through the reporting process. So this is absolutely an issue that involves domestic violence, sexual assault, and sex trafficking. But it's important to understand that those issues are symptoms of a larger issue. So at SBI, we absolutely support folks who are going through this, and it is a part of the MMIW issue. But there are lots of larger institutional racist issues within our systems and within our criminal justice system that lead to these high rates of missing and murdered. So it's really important to keep that in mind, that we need to really be challenging and questioning these systems that perpetuate this issue. So Jenn spoke a little bit about the jurisdiction, so I won't go too deeply into it, but when a crime happens on a reservation, who you call depends on where the crime happened, the race of the perpetrator of the crime, and the race of the victim of the crime, and then also the type of crime. And so if any one of those variables is different, it's a completely different jurisdiction that you need to report to. And so a lot of times when this is explained, we get this really neat kind of matrix. And the one that Jenn shared did go through some of those nuances, but that doesn't really help families and survivors who are actively in a crisis situation and need to make a report. So at SBI, we created this matrix here to help families navigate who has jurisdiction over their case. And if we need this kind of maze of a flowchart to determine who to call in a crisis, it's too complicated and it needs to be simplified. So why is reporting so difficult? Well, to say it simply, federal Indian law is too complex and it does not make sense. In law, there's usually a legal standard that is applied to kind of everything. It's logical, it makes sense. But with federal Indian law, since it's based on treaties and other policies, it really is a tribe by tribe basis. And so you essentially need a law degree to be able to understand this really complicated jurisdiction issue and other issues. And so it really creates a barrier for families and survivors who maybe don't have that Western education, that colonized kind of professionalism, but just have a missing or murdered loved one and they just want help. There's also a lot of racism and stereotypes about Indigenous people and the way that we live our lives. A lot of times when we try to report our women missing, we are hear back, oh, that woman, she's probably just out partying, she's just out drinking. You natives, you're really mobile, you move around, she's probably hasn't checked in. We've heard these really terrible stereotypes all of our life, and it continues today. And there's no other race that has to kind of like explain and convince folks to believe us when we go missing. So this creates a huge barrier, especially when it comes to missing people, because regardless of the race of person, that first 48 hours that somebody goes missing is really critical to being able to bring them home safely. And so police cannot use any resources to locate a missing person until they're officially identified as missing. And so our Indigenous people spend that first 48 hours, one, trying to figure out who the heck they're supposed to report to. And then once they figure it out, they have to convince them that this is a case worth taking seriously. And this is a barrier that no other group of people have to face. We also see a lot of impacts of intergenerational trauma resulting from boarding schools, forced removal, criminalizing of cultural practices. These were literal and specific policies that were created by the federal government during the era of kill the Indian, save the man. And so a lot of these policies are carrying out their intended impact. So for example, when we look at the criminalizing of cultural practices that happened at the same time that our families were being torn apart and taken to boarding schools. Our culture is how we process grief. It's how we heal. It's how we move forward past these really terrible issues. So at the same time that our families were being ripped apart, we weren't even allowed to do the ceremonies that we needed to mend our hearts and to bring that healing. And so that has resulted in just so much trauma that is still being addressed. And I really applaud the Native Wellness Institute for really looking at this issue of intergenerational trauma, because it truly is the root of this issue. As a result, there's a lot of mistrust after centuries of empty and broken promises. And these empty and broken promises are continuing today. So, like I mentioned earlier, a lot of people don't report when something happens to them because they just don't believe that law enforcement's going to do anything. And it's so traumatizing the way that our criminal justice system makes survivors relive the most terrible day of their life over and over and over again. And especially if you don't feel like you're ever going to get justice. So a lot of people just don't even try to report. And then when we speak with law enforcement, what they say is that, well, too many natives follow the snitches, end up in ditches, or, and it's just like, what are you doing as law enforcement to build that trust? Because what I'm hearing is that when law enforcement speak to Indigenous people, they don't think they're getting the whole truth. They don't think they're being honest with them. And this is based off of our interviews and experiences with law enforcement. And so, of course, people aren't going to report something that happened to them if they don't really believe that any difference is going to be made. So why is the lack of reporting an issue? Well, when we don't have these official government reports to look at, it leads to a gap in data. And when it comes to making change, policymakers really love to see data and statistics. And if they don't see that, it's hard for them to even know that there's an issue happening. So if you looked at kind of the data landscape on this issue, you would almost think that there wasn't an issue because we don't see those high percentages. However, we know based on our community expertise that that is not the case. And so we need to start gathering this data like SBI is doing and other organizations are starting to do now, so that we can recognize and demonstrate patterns, because it's also really important to have this data to identify solutions, because we don't know what the solution is if we're still figuring out what exactly the problem is. And so this lack of justice only encourages the violence to continue. There are people who understand that if they commit this particular crime in this particular place against this specific person, that they're a lot less likely to be caught doing that. And so we have this gray area of jurisdiction, which leads to our Indigenous people being targeted and preyed on. So a lot of times the response to, issues like this of racism are to do cultural competency trainings, but that's not enough. It's a great first step. It's the bare minimum, but our people, we deserve more than the bare minimum. So I would like to read some words from a survivor that we interviewed for a report in Northern California last summer that we released. So what they said was, so after the officer was saying he was sensitive to Native issues because of some training that he did, I was like, well, we're just trying to have a ceremony. And then he said, well, is there going to be drinking or is there going to be drugs there? And I said, well, for you knowing that you took the sensitivity Native class or whatever it is you did, why would you think that there would be drugs and alcohol at a ceremony? Like, who's thinking of Indians getting together and that we're probably going to be doing drugs and alcohol? But then he has this sensitivity, like he acts like he knows all about natives in this stuff. So, there's definitely some kind of racist something happening behind closed doors over there, where they're already setting their description of who we are, what we do, and how we live. And that's going to come all of this with, his force, the people that come after him. And so this really highlights the issue that the trainings are fine, but how are we ensuring that the lessons and the skills that are learned in the training are actually being implemented? Even just last year in Portland, we held this same week of awareness events about MMIW, and we addressed these issues. But then shortly after, during the protests, Portland police officers violated the Religious Freedom Act by confiscating an eagle feather and stomping out traditional medicines, while Indigenous protectors were simply just trying to pray for racist police killings to end. So clearly, I don't know if those officers were involved in any of these cultural competency trainings, but they clearly didn't learn. They didn't implement those lessons. And so, unfortunately, it seems like these cultural competency trainings are almost a checkbox so that law enforcement can say that they're doing something without actually having an impact and actually making a change. And we need a change because our people are dying. And this is critical, and we've seen an increase in these federal and state level task forces. And, at the beginning, we had great hope for these. We thought maybe these were people listening. But what we've seen now is that a lot of these task forces are just repeating the same cycle of harm and experiences that we've had since colonization. To my knowledge, none of these task forces have family members at the table. And when they do invite Indigenous people to participate, their suggestions are not implemented. And so the issue is that with a lot of these task forces, they're staffed with law enforcement and attorneys and people who are part of the problem. And, it's nothing on, law enforcement, they're just not researchers. A task force, the intent of it is to go out into the community, to listen to stories, to understand. But when a big part of this issue is police negligence and violence perpetuated by police, we're not going to feel comfortable sharing that with police. Police officers aren't researchers, they're interrogators. And that's not the energy that we need to make a difference in this issue, because it's not making a difference. We're getting there, but it's only because our Indigenous communities are being empowered and rising up, and we're creating our own systems and our own tables to come up with solutions to this issue. So at SBI yesterday, we released this public statement on Operation Lady Justice from a lot of grassroots advocates. When this initiative started, we were, again, really hopeful. This felt like this was finally the federal government was going to do something. However, it's been, since 2020, and we still haven't seen hardly any movement. I really encourage you all to check out our Facebook page and read this statement in its entirety. But the one paragraph that I really wanted to read from here: more than a seat at the colonial table, we have a right to create our own circles from which to design solutions, and we have a right to implement those solutions as sovereign, self-determining peoples. We denounce the practices and structure of Operation Lady Justice and other affiliated federal initiatives as rooted in colonial systems of power, abusive to families and their communities, and antithetical to the mission of creating a world free from violence for Indigenous peoples. So we are still accepting signatures, and we're going to continue to send this letter until we see change within this Operation Lady Justice. So if you're listening to this and you identify as a grassroots organizer or an MMIP family member, please reach out to us so that you can add your signature to this document. So now a little bit of an overview about what we do at SBI. So we're an Indigenous nonprofit, and we conduct and publish research in a culturally appropriate way. We have a database of over 4,500 missing and murdered Indigenous people. We also provide support services to families and survivors of MMIWG2. We learned that through our research, when we're doing these interviews, we're often asking people to tell us about the worst day of their life. And that's really hard. And so we totally try to recognize this. We take care of the folks who give us their expertise, who provide that knowledge that nobody else has. It's great. Like, we need people with law degrees, and we need people with all these Western ideas of education, but they just don't have that same level of expertise that survivors do. And the only way that you can ethically understand their story and hear their story is to provide those support services. And then we also uplift other scholars and advocates doing similar work. I get really frustrated when I hear people say that nobody's doing anything, that nobody's listening, because there are so many grassroots organizers, whether they're officially affiliated with an organization colonization or just doing the work that their community needs them to do, because we've had to do it. There hasn't been law enforcement to protect us. So we've had to kind of step in and protect ourselves. And so it's really important to recognize that the years and years and decades, I mean, this has been an issue since colonization. It's only recently that we attached a name and an acronym to it, but this is something that's been happening a long time. And so we fully believe that everybody has a role in this movement. And so we really love to uplift others. Now to get into some of the data that we collect. So our database collects a whole host of information, and something that's really beautiful about our database is that it's not only constantly growing in the number of cases that we have, but it's also constantly growing in the data points that we collect. Excuse me, whenever a family member or survivor asks us to add another data point, we always do it, no hesitations, no questions asked. And so this really reflects the collective community expertise that we have within our Indigenous communities on this issue. So some of the places that we get our data from, we often say that we get data by any means necessary. So we do check, federal databases, state databases. We file freedom of information requests with every single state. However, we don't really get a whole lot of information from those. We have some states like that, charge $7,000 for us to access their data. And there's just so many issues, and a lot of folks don't even have the data because they don't look for or identify race in their cases. And so we can't rely on just these official sources of information. And so you'll see here, if we only did that, we would miss a lot of the information. And so we're constantly going through social media. We work with families directly. We're really trying to gather verified information in any possible way that we can. So some statistics from our database. In the United States, we currently have documented 2,448 MMIWP. The average age is 26 years old. 88% of our cases are unsolved. 30% of the women and girls in our database are ages 18 and younger. And this is something that's really important for the city of Portland to understand, is that 54% of these cases happen in urban areas. I think there's this understanding of the MMIW issue is that it's a reservation issue, but that's not the case. A majority of our cases happen in urban areas. And so that's why it's so important for the Portland Police Bureau and other cities to really take this issue seriously and to really be proactive in knowing the signs and understanding the contributing factors to this issue. In Canada, we have documented 2,061 MMIWP. Average age is 27. In our Canadian cases, 92% of them are unsolved, and 1/3 of the women and girls are 18 and younger. The top states in the US make up 55% of all cases, Washington being the highest state, followed by Montana and Arizona. Canada's top provinces make up 76% of Canadian cases, with the tops being British Columbia and Alberta. We also see a really high correlation between pipelines and MMIW. So this is for a couple reasons. First, the location of pipelines are racist. For example, with the Dakota Access Pipeline, the original route for that pipeline was to go through a very large, predominantly white community. That community rallied and advocated for themselves because they didn't want their water to be impacted by this pipeline. And so they were successful in their means, and the pipeline was then rerouted to be more rural. But when it's more rural, that means it's going through tribal lands. And because Indigenous peoples aren't listened to by our systems in the way that this white town was listened to, our concerns weren't necessarily heard. So that pipeline was put right through tribal lands. And so we, in our report that we did a few years ago with the Brave Heart Society, we found a correlation between counties that that have high numbers of missing and murdered Indigenous women and the location of these pipelines. And so a lot of it has to do with these man camps. And so what a man camp is it's essentially temporary housing for pipeline workers, a lot of times who are men who live pretty transient lifestyles because their job is really building pipelines and going from rural area to rural area. So these men are all together and they don't have any ties to the community, no sense of accountability. And they know that since they're on a reservation, if they hurt our Native women, that they're not going to be caught. So there is a really high number of women who go missing after being seen at a man camp. And so it is really important that as we're addressing MMIW, that we also look at issues like extractive industries and pipelines, because there's so much more to this issue that we're still being uncovered. And I think that's one thing at SBI we're always trying to do. We know there are many roots to this issue, and the only way that we can understand those roots is if we have conversation with families and survivors to understand their individual story. So like I mentioned, we do have support services. This is really based in just that ethical, but even our cultural responsibility to practice reciprocity and to honor kind of the expertise of the families and survivors that we work with. We find that we learn more about this issue by doing really deep dives on individual cases by supporting families, because federal Indian law is so different in every region. It's really impossible to understand the nuances of the issue when you're only looking at kind of the national scope. So that's why we think it's really important to be community-based, to empower communities to do their own research, but then to also take care. So we provide weekly cultural art therapy circles. We have folks come together to bead, to talk. Sometimes we talk about heavy things, but most of the times we're just visiting and being in community with each other. We have a 24/7 confidential support line that accepts both calls and texts. And then we don't necessarily have like a menu of services because we try to be really flexible and meet folks where they're at. So when somebody is requesting services, our services coordinator, Carla, will have a conversation with them to help identify what their needs are. So sometimes it's help organizing vigils. We can help with finances for groceries, for rent, case advocacy. We also have relationships with some Indigenous therapists that we will pay for our clients to use. But really, we can do almost anything. We're not doctors and we're not lawyers, so we can't do medical care and we can't provide legal advice, but anything else we can cover. And if we can't, we'll work with you to figure out a place that can take care of you and a place that we trust. Here are some of the current projects that we have. Like I mentioned, last summer, we released our year 1 report for our Northern California research. We're in the midst of drafting our year 2 report right now, which will be released in July. Yesterday, for May 5th, we released an audio series of Elders' Words of Encouragement for MMIWG2 families. That's available on our website for free download and listen. We are also, like I mentioned, in the midst of drafting and gathering information for our next report for Northern California. So we do have an active survey right now that we would love for folks to take. You do not need to identify as a survivor to take the survey. The only thing is that you need to be Indigenous living in California, but not necessarily from a California tribe, or Indigenous to California but living outside of California. So if you fit within those parameters, please take the survey, help us write this next report. We're also working with families in Montana to create families first guidelines and protocols for law enforcement to follow when somebody goes missing or is murdered. We've also been really trying to vamp up our Two-Spirit and indigiqueer work. We realize that as a little data that exists on MMIW, there's even less on our Two-Spirit or LGBTQ or trans relatives, and they are often most targeted for this kind of violence. And so we're holding a convening of Two-Spirit and indigiqueer community organizers in a month, and really excited to have them help us decide the direction for that work. And then we also have a community mural project that we're trying to get started here in Northern California. So if you're a family member from Northern California, please reach out to us. And then not pictured here, we also have a report on COVID-19 and the violence against Indigenous people, which will be coming out in a few weeks. And then we're also going to do a sister report to our Northern California report by looking at Southern California, which will be released later this year. So a lot of folks are really interested in getting involved, which is great. We need as many people as we can. My biggest advice is to check out our MMIG2 and MMIP organizing toolkit, which is available for free download on our website. This is written by families and survivors and is over 200 pages of pretty much everything you need to know for community organizing and how to participate in this movement in a good way. Overall, my advice is to always center the voices and expertise of families and survivors. At SBI, we have a policy where we will not engage with projects who do not have families in leadership. It's also really important to believe and support survivors publicly in your personal life. We need survivors to feel empowered to be able to share their story, to report, but that can't happen until we support them. And so it's really important to be public about believing survivors and not just believing them behind closed doors. It's also important to support and uplift other advocates who are doing this work in a good way. We need to empower Indigenous communities with the resources and authority to decide how to best keep our communities safe. Obviously, I thought it was important because I accidentally included it twice, but this is really the biggest takeaway. A lot of people ask me, what can the government do to address this issue? And my response is always, you can step aside and let us figure it out. We've had centuries of the United States government telling Indigenous people what's best for us, and they don't know what's best for us. And that's clear because that's how we got into this crisis in the first place. So the only way that we're going to get out is to empower the people who have been doing this work, because law enforcement has not been doing this work. And so with that, that's about all I had to say about that. Here's my email address if you have any questions, if you'd like to get involved in any of the projects that I mentioned where we're seeking input. I'd really love to hear from you. Thank you. All right, everybody. Well, I think that's about the end of our time here. I really want to thank Jenn for joining me today, and really want to thank Native Wellness Institute for putting this on, the Urban Indian Health Institute for sponsoring today's events. There is still more happening this week. We've had a really great lineup of events. So this afternoon, there's going to be a youth and women's support circle learning about self-defense tools. And then on Friday at 1 o'clock, we're going to have some of our committee members talking about what we do for self-care. So with that, I think that's all. Have a good day.